Hello folks. In this video we plan to spotlight some of the speculators and swindlers who empowered the railroad boom in Kansas after the Civil War. Most of us remember the humorist and novelist Mark Twain, the author of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. He was an astute observer of events in that era. He was offended by the corruption and lust for wealth he saw, which he thought corrupted and corroded society. I think Twain's interpretation applies to the railroad construction mania that we saw in Kansas after the Civil War. During this era, communities across Kansas competed to build railroads. They offered subsidies in the form of bonds for railroad construction. These attracted serious investors as well as speculators and swindlers. Some hoped to sell their investments to mainline railroads. Others were fast-talking shysters, eager to dupe communities for personal gain. The new state of Kansas understood that railroads were vital to the region's future settlement and development. It authorized more than 1,100 railroads after the Civil War. In 1867, Governor Samuel Crawford told the legislature, "Railroads are indispensably necessary to the development of our resources and to our material prosperity. Their construction should be encouraged in every judicious and proper manner." Other governors agreed. A promoter could obtain a railroad charter for a payment of only $1 to the state. The vast majority of the 1,100 plans turned out to be paper railroads. They were never constructed and maintained. Some reflected the aspirations of local communities to prosper as centers of business activity. Others, the efforts of swindlers to turn a fast profit. Most failed for lack of funding and know-how. In many cases, elected officials pushed railroad construction plans in which they stood to benefit personally. In Chase County, promoters asked voters to approve a number of these schemes, and generally they did. The pioneers who settled Chase County were like those who settled other areas of the Trans-Mississippi West. Having traveled across the plains in rickety wooden wagons, they yearned for better transportation. Sam Wood, the Chase County founder, was behind a number of these speculative proposals. Wood, a Quaker from central Ohio, had come to Kansas determined to abolish slavery. He distinguished himself in efforts to make Kansas a free state. In 1866, after the war, Wood won an election to the Kansas Senate. A wheeler-dealer, to use a modern term, he became the acknowledged leader of that body. Some referred to the Kansas Senate as Sam Wood's Circus. He introduced legislation to allow the state of Kansas to guarantee up to $6 million in county bonds for the construction of railroads. This scheme failed. It was denounced in the press as an unconstitutional swindle. At the time, then Senator Wood was also an official of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. By present-day standards, his actions seem a serious conflict of interest. Such conflicts were quite common in the 19th century, when part-time legislators often had clashing business and professional responsibilities. For example, the first two U.S. senators from Kansas, James Lane and Samuel Pomeroy, both served as railroad presidents while in the U.S. Senate. There they pushed legislation transferring federal lands to the state of Kansas for railroad development. One historian of Western railroad expansion has observed that many of the most prominent of the country's politicians were involved in questionable practices. Many of those promoting Kansas railroads were members of the Kansas legislature and moved easily between the worlds of politics and business. Among them were Sam Wood, Cyrus K. Holliday, founder of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and Bob Stevens, the builder of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, or Katy line. When the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe experienced difficulties obtaining Eastern capital in the late 1860s, Sam Wood's enthusiasm for the project faded. Eager to promote regional development in the Flint Hills where he owned property, Wood pushed competing railroad plans. In May 1866, while still an official of the Santa Fe, Sam became superintendent of the new St. Louis and Santa Fe Railway. This was the brainchild of controversial Ottawa publisher and Baptist preacher Isaac Kalloch. Kalloch served as president of the St. Louis and Santa Fe. He was a spellbinding evangelist from Maine who had a checkered career. In 1857, he was tried for adultery in a racy New England trial reported in newspapers across the country. Coming to Kansas afterward, he gave up the ministry and settled in Ottawa. He served as the first president of Ottawa University, but he left under a cloud, accused of speculating with the college's money. Kalloch was also the prime mover behind the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad and became its president for 5 years. He talked 3 counties out of $675,000 in bonds to construct that railroad. Later, Kalloch moved to Lawrence and was elected to the Kansas legislature in 1873. He would hurriedly exit for California when his creditors caught up with him and demanded payments. In the Golden State, his troubled past resurfaced. He was wounded by an assassin before being elected mayor of San Francisco. His biographer depicts Kalloch as, quote, an unscrupulous rogue who was considered a god to thousands and a devil to thousands more. It's worth noting that Sam Wood and Kalloch teamed up to promote bond subsidies for the St. Louis and Santa Fe Railroad at various county meetings. They claimed the proposed line would extend the Missouri Pacific westward up the Neosho Valley to Emporia. Then it would cross the Cottonwood Valley and reach Marion on a track to the west coast via Santa Fe, New Mexico, thus linking St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. To obtain additional funding for the St. Louis and Santa Fe, Wood sought to transfer land grants given to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, believing that Cyrus Holliday's Santa Fe project would fail. Wood appealed in 1866 to the railroad's president, Senator Pomeroy, for help wresting away land grants of some 4 million acres. Pomeroy responded favorably. He promised to use his influence to transfer the land to the St. Louis and Santa Fe Railroad. Despite Kalloch and Wood's tag team hawking, the St. Louis and Santa Fe project failed. It declared bankruptcy after building only 38 miles of track in Missouri. In 1872, its assets were taken over by the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, the Katy line, the first railroad to enter Texas. Sam Wood moved to Texas after political defeats in Kansas and speculated in cattle. He was jailed for failing to comply with laws regulating Texas cattle business. There in prison, he devised a bold plan for Cottonwood Falls to become a railroad center and to achieve, quote, a glorious future as the metropolis of what was then called Southwest Kansas. Sam thought that Chase County could seize a large portion of the Texas cattle trade from Abilene. He predicted that 250,000 head of Texas cattle could come to Cottonwood Falls in 1871. Wood's plan depended on persuading Chase County voters to approve several railroad bonds. First, in collaboration with Henry Hunt, chairman of the county commission, Wood sought funding for the Chicago, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. Wood claimed this railroad would make Cottonwood Falls the heart of a vast railroad network linking the capitals of Kansas and Texas. The line would begin modestly with a mile of track from Strong City to Cottonwood Falls, then Wood hoped to obtain $200,000 each in bonds from Butler and Cowley counties to construct the road south to Indian Territory, the present-day Oklahoma border. Sam Wood claimed the railroad would capture the Texas cattle trade, carry supplies to Indian agencies and military posts, and boost Cottonwood Falls as a center of business. As the superintendent of this railroad, Sam set out to raise funds. He appealed to Chase County voters to approve $100,000 in bonds for the project in August 1871. He also asked voters to approve $50,000 for the Neosho, Cottonwood, and Arkansas Valley Railroad. Not surprisingly, he was also an officer of this railroad. It would run from Americus and Lyon County, where it intersected the Katy line, to Toledo and Eleanor and Chase County, and then to the south via Bazaar, Matfield Green, El Dorado, Winfield, and Arkansas City. Wood claimed it would bring railroad competition to Chase County, as many residents wanted. Voters approved both proposals in August 1871. The Chase County leader celebrated the outcome. "Cottonwood Falls will be the great town of southwestern Kansas," it said. An individual with the initials M.W., probably Wood's wife Margaret, wrote a Topeka newspaper applauding the result. "Cottonwood Falls, the key to the Walnut Valley, is henceforth the great railroad center of Kansas," she said. She wrote that Emporia may curb its selfishness and henceforth admit that Cottonwood Falls, instead of Emporia, is to be the metropolis of southern Kansas. At the same election, county voters approved $40,000 for building a new courthouse. Interestingly, railroads apparently were thought more essential than an elegant courthouse with a jail at that time. The majority for railroad construction of the two railroads was 154, and that for the courthouse, only 73. Interestingly, none of the railroad bonds approved in August 1871 were ever issued by Chase County. Sam's scheme simply did not attract enough support in other counties to warrant moving forward. His involvement aroused strong opposition in Butler and Lyon counties. Their leading residents favored a Walnut Valley Railroad affiliated with the Santa Fe, but not one through Cottonwood Falls. Another problem was Sam's reputation. An El Dorado newspaper bellowed, "There is not a man in the state who is acquainted with Sam Wood's past history who has a particle of confidence in him or his railroad schemes." Lyon County leaders saw Wood's plan as a threat to their ambition of making Emporia a regional railroad center. The Emporia News-Democrat, edited by Jacob Stotler, denounced Wood as, quote, "an unmitigated liar and demagogue." In a war of words, Stotler called Wood's plan railroad moonshine. He said that in the last 5 years, Wood had built 15 million miles of railroad on paper and not thrown a shovel of earth in actual railroad building. Later, Even the Chase County Leader satirized Sam's project, claiming its sponsors aspired to expand to Puget Sound in Siberia, but had not raised enough money to buy headlights for the locomotives. The paper suggested Wood's Railroad might rely on oxen to pull its cars. In retrospect, it was a classic example of a paper railroad. Probably the financial panic of 1873 contributed to its failure, as banks collapsed and capital dried up for railroad construction. Unable to obtain backing for these plans, the irrepressible Sam turned his attention to railroad construction elsewhere in Kansas. He promoted several other dubious railroad schemes in areas where he personally owned land. In Rice County, Sam pushed bonds for the Salina, Atlanta, and Raymond Railroad. It would make Raymond a cattle shipping center. Sam claimed Raymond was, quote, a very handsome point, destined to become one of the best towns of the state, but visitors to Raymond described it in less flattering terms. It had only 30 tents or houses, 12 of which were saloons, with all of the vile trappings of the cattle trade. Residents of Raymond would later claim that Wood made off with $10,000 in bonds voted for a school that was never constructed. A Kansas Legislative Investigating Committee looking at bond fraud recommended that lawsuits be commenced against Sam Wood and the bank involved. No money was ever recovered. In 1886, Sam sought to develop a town he named Woodsdale in remote and arid Stevens County. He proposed to make it the county seat. He also asked voters to finance another railroad, the Wichita, Springfield, and Trinidad, with $100,000 in bonds. Both issues failed in disputed elections. Open warfare between two towns in Stevens County, Hugoton and Woodsdale, ensued. Sam would be kidnapped and later assassinated in Hugoton. Sam Wood was as controversial in death as he had been in life. The Leavenworth Standard said about him, "It may be wrong to tell the truth about the dead, but sometimes it becomes necessary." He was a turbulent spirit, eternally fomenting strife and discord. Another Kansas newspaper was more tactful. Let Sam rest. That Sam was not a saint we all know, but he had so great a share of good qualities, no man who stood with Sam in the dark days of the 1850s had a word to say against him now. Of the dead, nothing ill is a good rule. Senator William A. Peffer, a populist, praised Wood. The history of Kansas does not contain a brighter jewel or a more heroic patriot than the name of Colonel Samuel N. Wood. But many who had business dealings with Wood saw him in a less favorable light. Critics labeled him an unscrupulous shyster. Those who claimed to know Wood well called him a bond thief and a malicious scoundrel. The Chase County Leader, which had supported many of Wood's railroad development plans, eventually denounced him as a shyster and a scoundrel who, for a fee, was trying to sell out the people to the railroad corporations. In Chase County, no one boosted railroads more enthusiastically than William Morgan, the publisher of the Chase County Leader. As noted in one of our earlier videos, in early 1887, Morgan celebrated the county's railroad boom. Quote, "4 new railroads are coming. All roads once led to Rome. Soon all railroads will lead to Cottonwood Falls and make Rome howl with envy and mortification." Like many similar editors of small-town newspapers, Morgan shaped and echoed the dreams of his readers. He backed a number of dubious rail plans that were stillborn. Several were paper railroads, boosted by smooth-talking speculators who hoped to sell out to established railroads. One, of course, was Sam Wood's Chicago, Kansas, and Texas. Another appealing but flawed railroad project surfaced in early 1886. Ranchers along the South Fork of the Cottonwood River in Chase County, such as Henry Brandley, had long desired competitive shipping rates. They wanted an alternative to the Santa Fe Railroad. In February 1886, residents of Falls Township, then Cottonwood Falls and Strong City, voted $40,000 to construct the Chicago Emporia and Southwestern Railway, proposed by a little-known Iowa railroader, William Jones. John S. Doolittle, a well-regarded rancher and merchant from Strong City who served in the Kansas legislature, was one of the directors of the Jones Railroad. Bizarre voters also approved $34,500 in bonds for this plan. Jones's railroad would run from Emporia down the South Fork to El Dorado. The Santa Fe Railroad sought to block this initiative. It hired Sam Wood, who asserted the Jones Railroad was an effort to steal bond money. He labeled Jones a swindler. Some believe Jones was fronting for Jay Gould, the unscrupulous New York speculator who'd taken over the Missouri Pacific Railway in 1879. The Chase County leader, which favored the Jones proposal, accused Wood of being a, quote, robust liar and a mouthpiece for the Santa Fe. As it turned out, the bond issues passed in Chase County with robust majorities. Residents celebrated the outcome with a band concert and bonfires, but the Jones Railroad failed to gain necessary funding elsewhere. Having killed off the Jones plan, the Santa Fe completed a short line in 1887 from Eleanor to Bazaar to facilitate cattle shipments. But despite earlier promises, it did nothing to extend the line to Matfield Green and El Dorado in Butler County. Apparently, big stockholders and directors opposed further branch line expansion at that time. Perhaps the biggest railroad scam of the era was one associated with State Senator Johnny Long and his Kansas, Colorado, and Texas Railroad. Long, a former state senator from Sedan, incorporated a railroad in 1886 to connect Kansas City with San Antonio, Texas, via Wichita. It would go through Chase County, Long said. Long had no prior experience operating a railroad. His job experience was in the grocery business. His associates in the enterprise included several friends from Winfield, one a former hardware store owner, and another a retired probate judge. Despite his lack of experience and funds, Long's pitch attracted local governments and voters hungry for railroad construction. He persuaded voters across Kansas to approve $1.5 million in subsidies for his railroad, the Kansas, Colorado, and Texas. With support from quarryman Barney Lantry, rancher Stephen F. Jones, and other local leaders in Chase County who sought more competitive freight rates, Chase County voters also succumbed to Long's magic. They approved a $140,000 bond issue in October 1886 by a vote of 929 to 774. Johnny Long, whose real name was Julius Carey Long, dazzled the Kansas press with frequent optimistic predictions and a large staff in his Kansas City office. He surrounded himself with engineers, draftsmen, surveyors, clerks, and typewriters. Periodically, they emerged to visit a community and awaken hopes and expectations. Long claimed to have the backing of the Pennsylvania Central Railroad. Apparently he didn't, or he lost it as economic conditions deteriorated and railroad overexpansion became better known to Eastern investors. Long had overpromised and underperformed. A Burlingame newspaper labeled him the champion liar of the 19th century. A Bluff City editor who knew Long observed that his enthusiasm for his project indicated how people could be hoodwinked by smooth-tongued speculators. Real estate investors in Wichita bribed Long with $6,000 to locate his depot near their properties, but they fought back when Long failed to perform. They had him arrested. Long was released from the Wichita jail and allowed to flee to California in a Pullman car only after he reimbursed these investors. It's worth noting that among counties in the Flint Hills region, Chase County actually dispersed the smallest amount of public funds to railroad, $85,000. That amount included $80,000 for the Chicago, Kansas and Western, and $5,000 to the Santa Fe from Toledo Township. Lyon County provided the most aid to railroads, $436,000, followed by Butler County, $380,000. But voters in Chase County had authorized considerably more than $85,000. At least $784,000 by my count, or about $22 million in contemporary dollars. They never issued these bonds because many of the railroad plans simply did not get off the ground. They were paper railroads. Most counties did not disperse funds until rail construction was complete. But in the early 1870s, investors tricked Marion County. Several Junction City speculators proposed to construct the Kansas and Nebraska Railroad, which they said would extend from the northern boundary of Kansas in Marshall County to Junction City, Marion, Wichita, and the state's southern boundary. Behind the plan were several prominent businessmen, notably Robert McBratney, a federal land office official, and Alfred Pierce, a former state representative. The group swindled Marion County voters for $100,000 in bonds for a railroad never built. The Panic of 1873, which dried up capital for railroad construction, may have doomed the project, but Marion County voters were left holding the empty bag. Courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, ruled that the Marion County Commission owed innocent purchasers of the railroad bonds $100,000. The county commissioners refused to pay interest on the bonds and went into hiding, meeting in out-of-the-way barns late at night to conduct the county's business. But the judiciary employed U.S. Marshals to deliver legal notices, and finally the Marion County Commissioners accepted their obligations. One newspaper estimated that with interest and legal fees, the total cost approached $300,000. What may we conclude from today's discussion? The period of post-Civil War railroad building in Kansas offers a window to the Gilded Age of American growth. During this era, the public obsession with faster and more reliable transportation sometimes enabled speculators and swindlers to manipulate opinion for personal gain. But it's worth remembering that improved transportation was vital to the settlement and critical development of Kansas. Unforeseen circumstances, such as economic downturns in the 1870s and European wars, may have dried up investment capital at critical moments and doomed some otherwise sound railroad construction plans. But it's also true that many of the railroad plans had little prospect for success and represented the pipe dreams of speculators and settlers. Thanks for watching this video, the last in our three-part series on railroads in Chase County and the Flint Hills.